That's what we think of. This is entirely false. Only about 200 years of active Viking age. Violence was absolutely a part of their daily lives. It was definitely to make the most money so that they could get what they needed to continue living their lives back home. Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Scott Russell. I am a senior history educator here at the Mariners Museum and Park, and I get the honor, pleasure, and privilege of getting to talk to you guys about Vikings. And here's the thing that a lot of people always think about when we think of Vikings is, were they pirates? Were they explorers? Why can't they be both? And maybe they are, maybe they aren't, but regardless, this question here is an important one for us to discuss whenever we bring up the conversation of Vikings. And what's really interesting is when we think of Vikings, the thoughts that we have about Vikings are often quite different from what they truly were when we look at the history of who the Vikings were. So when we're talking about Vikings, this is what we think of generally when we think of them in our imagination. We think of the horned helmets. We think of the wild, crazy beards. We think of the maybe suggestions of leather armor, bare-chested, large men screaming with a giant battle axe. Generally, that's what we think of when we picture Vikings and we talk about Vikings in our psyche and in our imagination. Oftentimes, this is entirely false. Here's some interesting stuff up here on the board. Almost all the photos that you will see today are actually images we have in our museum collection, or at the very least, they are related to our museum collection. I will point out a couple that are not, but all the ones you see up here are ones you can actually find somewhere in our collection, whether it's in a library book, a photograph, a painting, or actual objects, which you can see quite a few of here. So I want to point out this big guy right here on the left, my friend over here with the large, massive horns. This is actually not what kinds of helmets that Vikings would wear. And in fact, here's an interesting thing is when any group of people was to wear a helmet of some sort for the purposes of battle, they would almost never have some kind of long, elongated horns, even if it was decorative. Because you can imagine, if I'm trying to use a bow and taking something off my shoulder, if that gets caught in my horns and snaps, well, then I'm screwed. That's not going to work very well. What if I reach back my sword and I clip it and get stuck in my helmet? Well, now I'm still not going to have a very good time. Historians have actually not found a single actual Viking helmet that has horns on it at all. When you look at the archaeological findings that people have done over the course of centuries of work, any potential helmet that has these horns is actually not related to the Vikings at all. Now, the ones that we have found, generally speaking, are going to simply be helmets that will cover the top half of the face. There are slits for the eyes, there's a protection for the nose, and they're very, very simple. They really genuinely just will sit on your head as an actual protectant, which is going to be the most effective rather than just a kind of thing that sits on your head to look kind of cool. And get me wrong, it does look cool. But historically speaking, it wasn't very useful. So we can get rid of that image. We don't need to think about that one for right now. And in fact, most of the time when we think of these, this actually comes from a stereotype that several Scandinavian artists kind of started to take creative advantage of in the 1800s. They started to depict Vikings in these kinds of battle garbs and things. And over time, it was adopted as a stereotype across media of all forms, whether it was paintings, art, drawings, and even movies and television shows that we can see today. But if we actually look at the history, that's not accurate at all. Same deal as if you look very closely up here, we also like to think of Vikings as having those wings on their helmets, as you can see with our friend up here as he talks to some Native Americans. And we'll get to that, don't you worry. We'll talk about their relationship with Native Americans for sure. But oftentimes you would not see these depictions of wings actually coming out of their helmets. They could potentially be carved into the sides, but very rarely did we see those kinds of things in archaeological finds. Few other fun things. Yes, they did use mostly axes of this sort, okay? In fact, swords in particular for the Vikings were very interesting because they were mostly seen as symbols of power and profit, and only the richest, most wealthy Vikings often had swords. More frequently, you would see them have axes similar to this. Fun fact about this axe, though, which we do have in our museum collection, is this one's actually from, if I remember correctly, let me make sure I say my right words. This is actually from the 17th century, so about the 1600s, which, fun fact, is long after the Viking Age. But we are also positive that the actual blade of the axe itself is much older. So we are pretty sure that at the very least this was modeled after similar Viking axes from the time period. So we're getting, kind of as we go down this list, we're getting a little closer to the reality of who the Vikings were. This carving on the far right is actually a potential Viking-esque carving, and it was also often used as a way to instill fear in the people that they were going to go and raid and pillage, because, like I said at the start, they are considered pirates by most of the people that they interact with who are not from their own region. Now, here's an interesting thing just in general when we think of Vikings, right? This is all what we think of in our imagination. But who were they really? Who were the Vikings actually? And when we talk about who the Vikings are, we have to break it down into what the word even means. There's two general schools of thought here. The phrase Viking is going to either refer to the word vik, which means an inlet, or fjord, which comes from both the regions of Denmark or Norway. So perhaps it was from whence they came, the fjords, the waterways that they frequented and started off as. Perhaps that's the reason. There's also an Old Norse word that is called Vikingr. And I'm going to mispronounce a ton of words here today. I do apologize, just as a heads up. But regardless, Vikingr usually meant pirate or raider during that time period. So when we talk about the phrase of Vikings, we are retroactively naming a group of people who, generally speaking, came from the northern portions of Europe, off the general mainland. Places like Norway, places like Denmark. Those general regions are who we are talking about when we mention who the Vikings actually were. But here's the thing, because the Vikings were not an ethnic group, they were not a specific group of people. It was an amalgamation term that was coined long after they were already done raiding. It's difficult for us to say, this is exactly who the Vikings were, which is super fun for me as I get to explain to you guys who exactly the Vikings were. Now, this phrase that I mentioned, Vikingr, was in use from the 12th to 14th centuries, so right at the tail end of the Viking Age, which was going to be around from about 800 AD to about 1100 AD, or Common Era, excuse me, CE. So as people groups, that's kind of generally who we're talking about. They were merchants. They traded with a lot of people. They were really good at it, actually. They were also raiders, as I have established now quite clearly. But they were also brilliant mariners. And I do mean brilliant mariners. Now, the Viking Age began a little earlier than 800 Common Era. Around 793 Common Era, there was actually an attack on the Lindisfarne Monastery off the coast of Northumberland. That's in northeast England, okay? That's around what we consider is the beginning of the Viking Age. And these people from these regions that we've established thus far got into what they were called was longboats. They crossed the sea and they arrived mostly in monasteries. And we're going to explain and talk a little bit about maybe why that is shortly, because like I said, they were raiders. But the fact is this. Vikings, okay, even though it's very difficult to pin them down as a group, they left a massive, marked impact on the world in several ways, which is why, even though it's difficult to say this is exactly who they are, there's a good reason for us to be talking about them. So, from the 9th century-ish, around 800 Common Era, to about the 12th century, around 1100 Common Era, that's when the Vikings were making their moves. Only about 200 years of active Viking Age. And yet here we are, over 800 years after they have been done for quite a while, still talking about how they impacted our world. They're interesting folks. So who were they? Raiders. Now, as I mentioned, the beginning of the Viking Age started with an attack on a monastery. Monasteries are places of worship for Christians. And these Vikings, the people who showed up, took as much of the silver and gold as they could. They took as much of the offerings that the church and the monastery had as they could, and they killed many of the monks, most of whom were unarmed, most of whom had no combat experience whatsoever. Why would they do this? Moving beyond just this one instance, over time, this is the kind of tactics that the Vikings are going to establish. Would they attack merchants? Absolutely, of course. Would they attack towns? Of course, absolutely. But the vast majority of their raids took place in places of Christian worship, churches, and monasteries. Now, it's difficult to say exactly why this is, but because their focus often ended up on monasteries and on churches, these Vikings, right? Because they focused so heavily on these two places, they got a really bad rap for being incredibly violent, brutal heretics, barbarians who were just the absolute worst. Okay, so Scott, it sounds like you're really painting these guys as pirates, not explorers then. Well, yes, they absolutely were pirates. The Vikings are pretty interesting. So they didn't worship the Christian God, which is one of the reasons why they were so willing to carry out these attacks. They had no relation. Oftentimes we think of Norse mythology, the beliefs of these people that the Vikings may have worshipped, people like gods like Loki, Thor, Odin, this kind of Norse mythos and religion that kind of is surrounding what the Vikings did and why they did these things. And that may have had some play as to why they were willing to attack these Christian groups. They didn't have any relationship with them. They didn't care about this Christian God. None of this stuff mattered to the Vikings. But at the end of the day, the reason the Vikings probably did this is because it made them the most money the easiest. Vikings attacked fast and hard. Their ships were designed so that they could go up onto the beach quickly and be taken off the beach quickly. Vikings used the element of surprise most of the time that they conducted their raids. They took their ships up into the beaches as close to the buildings as they could. Their men would hop out as fast as possible, go in, take everything they could of value, and run out before any reinforcements could potentially arrive. They were gone in the blink of an eye. And they didn't mind attacking these groups because they were the easiest ones to hit. What's going to be simpler? Going to a town that's heavily defended and might make you a ton of money, don't get me wrong, which is why there were several Viking raids on coastal villages where they could make a ton of money. But also, the Vikings didn't want to lose their own men. They were not willing to allow their people to die so easily. And so oftentimes they focused on this, which is one of the reasons why the Vikings get this interesting rap as such brutal pirates. Even though when we look at the archaeological finds, and particularly the anthropological finds, looking at the bones and looking at the body makeup of Vikings, violence was absolutely a part of their daily lives, but it's also shown that they were definitely herders. They were farmers, and they attacked these different groups in seasons, actually. It was not something that the Vikings were doing constantly. It was definitely to make the most money so that they could get what they needed to continue living their lives back home, at least for a time. Now, again, this is not to say that the Vikings were not brutal in their tactics and treatments of those that they pillaged. As I mentioned, these foreign invaders would take everything from the monasteries and churches that they arrived at. There are particularly when we talk about how the Vikings attacked and changed drastically what Ireland began to look like, because the Vikings traveled very far, as we will talk today. The Vikings managed to make it to Ireland in about 795 Common Era, and they attacked the monastery of St. Patrick at Armagh. They slaughtered the monks, they desecrated the buildings, they took all of the riches that they could, and then they left. Over the next few decades, they continued to make raids on Irish soil. Now, Generally speaking, around 840 Common Era, the Vikings started to establish permanent settlements. So at this point, it was no longer about just the piracy. It was no longer about just raiding. They started to establish towns. They started to establish trading villages, places that they could take the things that they had garnered over the years and sell them to different groups of people, including the Irish. But the Vikings were also enslavers. When they arrived, particularly in Irish soil, if they captured you and decided not to kill you, you were enslaved and sold for a profit, because the Vikings, as kind of evidenced by a lot of their actions, they were going into this business partially for a bit of glory, perhaps, if you're going the Norse mythological route. But a lot of it was so that they could maintain a lifestyle that they were interested in. I noticed that a couple of people have questions. If you do, please raise your hands so nice and high so Wisteria can bring the microphone to you. I'm happy to try and answer any questions that I can. But I think we've got one right up here.
Was kind of what empires were at the time. At the time where they were attacking Ireland, were the Celts inhabiting at that time, or did the Celts come a little bit?
Give me 2 seconds to look back through my notes really quick. So I don't believe so. In my notes, I don't have any mention of when the Celts were really doing quite as much. And again, someone's going to correct me in the chat, which is great. Thank you for doing that. But generally, what the Vikings were doing, so they'd arrived around 840, right? Give or take. They'd really started to establish themselves as this kind of trading empire. And again, pretty violently, I might add. But they were also, again, starting to establish more than just one place. So there are actually some of the most iconic places in Ireland, actually, such as Dublin, Wexford, Waterford, Cork, Limerick. They were all established originally by the Vikings. And so they established these trading ports, which is something that, probably wasn't intended to become these strongholds of Ireland now. And again, many of these are very important cities to the nation now. But over time, Norse influence will decline. So they started in around 840, but over the next almost 200 years, they started to lose influence. And part of that is because in Ireland, they did not have a single centralized government for quite a long time. And it isn't until almost 1000 Common Era, which we'll come back to 1000 Common Era again when we talk about Leif Erikson. But around that time, actually, because it had been such a decentralized style of government throughout Ireland, the Vikings never actually established themselves as the main government in that region. And so around 1014, the High King Brian Boldroom actually managed to essentially end the Norse influence and the Viking influence in Ireland and take back the island for the people, for the Irish people at the time. So great question. Sorry I couldn't give a super specific one on the Celts, but the Vikings did, again, establish some very important parts to Irish culture, but at the end of the day, they were routed and they did leave. It looks like I got another question right over here. That's a great question. So my friend over here just asked, to establish settlements, you need to bring your women in. So when did they start doing that? Around 840. That's when they started to establish themselves. So they've been raiding for about 50 years prior to the establishment and that they began to build in 840, at least in Ireland. But over time, the Norse influence began to wane because of the influence of this rising king of actual Irish descent. So the Vikings, actually, another piece that I forgot to mention is that Viking men and women were all going out and fighting. They were not just men the entire time. That's another stereotype that we think about. The women were also involved in often several of these raids. Not every raid and not all the time, but the women were absolutely able and encouraged to do so at times. In terms of wives as well as the establishment of settlements, that's going to be one of the reasons why some of these settlements are going to fail, is because eventually they're going to stop bringing their own women and they're going to start to kind of disperse throughout these regions. Many of the Vikings in Ireland didn't necessarily leave, they just faded to the background as they began to adopt Christianity and things of this nature. That's a great point and a great question. All right. So I've talked a lot about how they were raiders, and I think we can establish that pretty clearly. But as I mentioned, they are brilliant, and I do mean brilliant mariners. They knew what they were doing when it came to exploration. So they had their very own navigational techniques, and this is also during a time when Europeans did not have access quite yet to anything but the stars. The magnetic compass, and the time that I'm going to start focusing on for the Viking Age, is not popular in Europe. It was already created and invented and in use, particularly in China, around the Viking era and age. But for Europeans, they did not have the magnetic compass, which means how did they know where north was? An important question. But they're going to many of my friends are pointing up into the sky. They're going to use celestial objects. So most of their navigational techniques are going to come from things that we actually can't really replicate anymore because they did not have other options. So the Vikings were very incredibly skilled mariners. They had lighter and faster ships than most others during this time period, and I'll show a couple of examples of those ships from our collection in just a few moments. This is evidenced by how easily they were able to navigate not only across the Baltic and North Seas, but eventually across the Atlantic as well. And again, they're going to do this using mostly celestial navigation. They use the moon, the stars, and the sun in order to find their way and manage to make their directions known, even without having most of the tools that we would think of or use today. I noticed that a friend of mine was looking to ask a question.
Are they literate?
Were they literate? Yes. Yes, they were. They were literate in their own languages, absolutely. And in fact, the reason we know so much about the Vikings is because everywhere they went, they often would leave behind carvings into stone. And so we know some of where they ended up because of their runic inscriptions. So they were literate in their own languages, maybe not necessarily the languages of the people they met, but they absolutely were literate in terms of their own languages. And again, those would be Nordic runic inscriptions. Now, when they were navigating far outside of land, this is when they really started to use different techniques. So the sounding lead was a very common instrument to be used during this time. They basically would take a rope and a chunk of lead and you would drop it down. And depending upon how long it takes, how long the rope is, and also the sound that you could then feel and or hear, dependent upon the use of this, you would be able to tell the depth, which was great if you were close to the shore. So this is very helpful when you're going back and forth between the inland areas, going through rivers, or trying to maneuver around in the seas. But it's not great for the Atlantic Ocean, which is far too deep for a sounding lead to be used. But it was one option they had. Other things that the Vikings would do is they would use every other option available to them. They would look at the birds. There's actually a story I'll talk about shortly of how the Vikings very cleverly used birds to their advantage to sight where land was and understand where they were going. They also observed the shadows of where the sun was casting it on their gunwale or on tools that they had, which I'll explain in just a second. They had a great understanding also of the stars in particular. They were able to determine kind of what the sun's azimuth was, as well as make pretty accurate observations of the sun's declination, which allowed them to figure out their latitude as well. And again, this is going to be using a tool that I'll mention in just a moment. They also used, some people say that it's potentially, they used the color of the water itself, the ways the tides change. Some people claimed that they tasted the water to figure it out. And a lot of this is getting into pseudoscience, so we're not 100% sure with some of these, but we do have some really interesting proof that shows us some of the other tools that they did have. So there's actually in several Viking sagas, and sagas were very interesting for the Vikings. The sagas often are considered works of literary fiction, but the actions that were taken by several of the people and characters in these sagas have actually retroactively been proven to potentially be accurate. So we're going to take these sagas and we're going to hold them loosely as historians and people who care about history. We're going to hold on to them because they will inform us But we need to not just have one source to prove something to be accurate and true. We have to have multiple sources. So keep that in mind as we're talking about the sagas. But in these sagas, there's mention of something called a sunstone, a sun compass, if you will, as well. And these tools actually made it possible for the Vikings to know their latitude using the shadows of the sun to figure out where they were. Now, in knowing your latitude, you can go from east to west. You can't go from north to south. So it's good in some ways, but not as accurate as the tools that we have today. And even less accurate were these tools compared to things like the quadrant and astrolabe, which would come during the remainder of the age of exploration. I'm not sure if you guys have had those conversations pertaining to people like Columbus and the rest of those folks who discovered North America. Hint, they didn't. That was going to belong to the Vikings. We'll talk about that in a second. But these tools here did make it potentially possible for them to figure out where they were in the world using their latitude. So to give a little bit of a, not demonstration, but a little bit of clarity as to how they used these tools. So sunstone, this guy right over here on the far left, this is called Icelandic spar, sometimes called calcite. This has a really interesting property that actually allows you to see when you hold it up to a light. It actually has this property to split the image in the stone in two. Okay, now this process is called birefringence, and essentially what it does is when you have light passing through this, okay, it splits along two paths and forms double images. So what's interesting about this, when we're talking celestial navigation, what do you need to see in order to navigate? You need to see the sun. You need to see the light of something in the sky. What if it's foggy? What if it's cloudy? What if the sun is nowhere to be seen? How do we navigate that? In the sagas, it's mentioned several times, the use of a thing called a sunstone. Calcite has this interesting property where if you hold it up to the sun, you can actually see where the light splits. And even if you hold it up as the sun is hidden by a cloud or fog, you can still see where it splits the light, making it potentially possible for the Vikings to make these treks, even in cloudy conditions and foggy conditions. Now again, sunstone from the sagas, literary potential fiction. We got to hold that pretty loosely here. But this thing here called the Viking compass, or a bearing dial or sun compass, allows you to determine the latitude and direction of north pretty accurately by using the sun's shadow. Essentially, you would take this curved dial, and this is part of one that had been found in an excavation involving the Vikings. You'd take this curved dial and you'd have a piece to it that you would then hold up, and you'd take measurements at the same time in different regions. That shadow should stay the same each time. And as long as you measure it around the same time, you get the same reading each time. So then as you move from west to east or east to west, in the case of the Vikings, that shadow will change because the sun doesn't change its positioning, but you are, which means you can then retroactively figure out where you are in the world, what your latitude is, using this tool. So, again, pretty smart stuff for people who did not have access to tools like we have today, which make it a lot easier for us to navigate in the waters. So, again, a lot of this is theory. We're going to be honest. We do not have, and one of the hard parts about even these theories here, particularly with the sun compass, the bearing dial, and the sunstone, no sunstone, no calcite has been found in any Viking shipwreck as of yet. So maybe it wasn't that. But this stone was found often in Iceland, which is why the theory goes that this is a potential possibility for this is the real kind of sunstone and could be used. But again, we're kind of retroactively deciding that as historians. Regardless, though, this is some really, really helpful, these are really, really helpful tools which give us insight as to how the Vikings were actually able to cross the Atlantic. And we do have a lot of evidence for that being accurate and true. All right, So what kinds of other tools did they use? Well, they used different ships. They had a couple of different kinds of ships. These are all examples that we have in our museum collection. I'm really sorry we don't have an actual full-on finished Viking ship here in the museum. That'd be pretty awesome. But we do have several model ships that give a really clear and helpful image and understanding of what Vikings were using. So this top row is Mora, which is William the Conqueror's ship. Well, whatever. That's the top row, okay? Now, this is William the Conqueror's ship. It was made by August Crabtree. I love talking about Crabtree. If you've ever heard me talk in here, I talk about Crabtree and his stuff often because he makes some incredible, cool stuff. But as I mentioned, that's William the Conqueror. He wasn't a Viking, Scott. I don't think he was, right? And you'd be right, but he was a descendant of the Vikings. And the thought being, as Crabtree was creating this ship model in particular, was that he was accepting that this would be the general appearance of what those ships would look like. Now, there are more modern findings that give us a better understanding of what these Viking ships looked like, and they do look pretty similar. They often had oars to power the ships, but they were every single one that we found thus far, if they were sailing ships, had a single square-rigged sail. And again, these are the kinds and sizes of ships that, again, cross the Atlantic, which seems crazy, but it's not impossible, believe it or not. The bottom row, now that top one and then the one in the bottle, those are both considered dracars. The reason they're called dracars is because of the size, as well as the figurehead on these ships. If there was a dragon on top in the front, it was called a dracar, because dracar meant dragon. And so the bottom one is more likely the style of ship that actually would have crossed the Atlantic. That bottom one is called a Knarr, K-N-A-R-R. And that is the most likely candidate of Viking-style ships which would have made the trip across the Atlantic. It was generally used for deeper water voyages. As you can see, even in the creation of it, it's quite a bit wider and goes quite a bit deeper. But you'll also notice for all three of these styles of ships, there's not a cargo hold. It's all a single deck. Everything is just out in the open. Again, think about how difficult this journey must have been for this kind of style of ship, and yet it was done. All right, so how were these Vikings able to do all these things? We have some of the tools. They seem a little shady, Scott. I'm not going to lie to you. These tools that you're talking about, they seem like pseudoscience. They don't seem super accurate. They don't seem super real. Give me some details. How in the world are these guys going to do this? In order to do that, we got to talk about these sagas that I'd mentioned before, and then I'll back it up a little bit with some of the archaeological evidence we've been finding over the last several decades. But in order to do this, we have to talk about Iceland and the description of how many Vikings eventually would make their way to this island. Now, the Vikings were pretty sure are not the first people to discover Iceland. There was evidence, as well as in the sagas, as well as archaeological, that there were already some monks who'd made it to Iceland, most probably from Ireland. But in around the 9th century Common Era, there is a legendary figure named Floki Vilgerdsson, who comes from Norway. And he is claimed to be one of the first settlers in Ireland. And how did he do this? Well, in the stories of Floki, he apparently brought 3 ravens with him as he was going to make this voyage out into open waters. He brings 3 ravens with him. He'd heard of this land where there was blades of grass dripping with butter. So he wants to go to this new land that someone had mentioned to him. And so he decided as he sailed that he would release the ravens at different points in time. And again, this seems crazy, but it's not impossible or even improbable to think about. So he's got these 3 ravens. He begins to sail for a few days. He releases one of the ravens. And the story goes that the raven sailed back home towards Norway. Flew all the way back home toward Norway. All right, Floki's thinking, okay, I'm too close to where I was. There's no land else out here. I need to keep going. Sails for a bit longer. He releases the second raven. It goes up. Over time, it eventually returns to the ship. He's too far out at the ocean for this bird to figure out where land is. Okay, all right. he sends up the third raven a few bit later. This third raven goes the opposite direction, west, away from home. Floki realizes now, I need to follow that bird. Because if that bird is heading this direction and continuing to go that direction, it knows where land is. That bird can't survive out here in the water, and neither can I for too much longer. I need to follow that bird. And believe it or not, according to the stories, that's how Loki found land. Again, it seems far-fetched, but thinking about what tools were available to the Vikings and the people of this age in order to navigate, it's not improbable. Birds are a great way for mariners to figure out where land is, because some birds can hang out in the water for longer than others, but ravens need to get to land faster. So, again, potentially. But regardless, Iceland begins to be settled by Vikings, peoples of this group, okay? Eventually, other colonists are going to follow Floki during the reign of King Harald while he's attempting to unite Norway under his rule in around 860 Common Era. And so from about 870 to about 910 Common Era, Iceland is going to get a large influx of Norwegian Vikings in particular. Around 930, the people of Iceland decide they need a governing body, and they name it the Althing. Now, this is just their way of kind of creating the setup of government so that they can ensure that they all have equal rights to the things that they were hoping to have in this new land that they've found. Now, that brings us to Thorvald Osvaldsson. Now, Thorvald is the father of Eric the Red, who you may have heard of as the discoverer of Greenland. Now, Thorvald was originally from Norway, but he was exiled for manslaughter, which brought him and his family all the way to Iceland. Which then brings us to Eric, because unfortunately Eric does the exact same thing that his dad does and commits manslaughter, which is why eventually Eric is then kicked out of Iceland. Like father, like son, I guess, guys. Again, something to think about when we're talking about these sagas is how they are intended perhaps to be more literary than historical. I know that that seems kind of counterintuitive as I'm standing up here telling you this is how the Vikings did all this stuff. But that's one of the challenges we have when we're looking at history is we have to hold these things to understand them better. But we also have to recognize some of this might seem a little far-fetched. Regardless, Eric is described in the Icelandic sagas in particular as being hot-headed and red-haired, which is why he was named Eric the Red. Eric followed in his footsteps and was exiled from Iceland for killing men in a fair fight. He was sentenced to lesser banishment, which was only 3 years because the killing was in a fair fight. You know, that makes sense, right, everybody? He then leaves Iceland, and he goes out in search of a rocky area in the oceans that he had heard of that was off to the west of Iceland. All right. So, Eric is kicked out of Iceland. He decides he's going to go west because I can't stay at home for the next 3 years. My dad was exiled back in my old home. Can't really go back there. I guess I'll just keep heading west. That brings us to Greenland. Now, here we've got some depictions of the potential routes that could have occurred. Again, the writings of the Vikings were essentially not clear. Any writings that we had from the Vikings, as we described, were in their Nordic runes, but they were carved into stone. They did not use paper documentation. So any writings that they had were minimal comparative to what we have available to us today. We have literally all information at our fingertips. But Eric the Red, in around 982, left Iceland and sailed west. In his journey, he's going to find Greenland. Now, why did he name it Greenland? Because if you go look on a map today, Greenland is not very green. It is incredibly icy. And there's a lot of theories kind of surrounding this conversation. People generally believe Eric was probably just trying to convince other people to come out to this land because he couldn't go home. So his goal was probably to entice other Icelanders to join him in this new region. Now, some people say, he probably wasn't lying. Maybe at the time, it was really green and beautiful. And here, this is the truth. There were parts of Greenland at the time, and even today, that are quite green. There were pastures all throughout. It was a great place for grazing animals during certain seasons, and for a short period of time. But the vast majority of Greenland, even in that time, we are led to believe by the sagas that it was very, very icy. And Eric was probably conning people into coming to this new place so that he could establish himself as a person of import rather than having to go home disgraced after he'd been banished already. So, that is the story of what we're able to discern from Eric's point of view. Now, we do have archaeological evidence that clearly dictates that helps us to see that there is a lasting Viking presence in Greenland around 985 Common Era. So around that point in time, that's when we really start to see the most of the Greenlanders sticking around, as they were called oftentimes. So there's the Icelanders, the Greenlanders. The Greenlanders are the ones from Greenland, you know. So regardless, there were two major outposts established here. There was the Eastern Settlement, which was actually at the southern portion, which is that first dot you can see on the map on the far right. But then there was also the Western Settlement, which did not stick around quite as much. So Greenland, over time, the Greenlanders were going to establish themselves for a while, which is why eventually, as our friend pointed out here, they had to start bringing the women and the children out, and they did. So the women and the children began to establish their colony here in Greenland. Eric being the man in charge, the man of the hour, the guy with the power. He reserved the best places for himself according to these sagas, and the largest spots where he could really make sure he had the best of the best, since he discovered it, you know? That was at least how he is painted in these sagas. But in terms of how long the Greenland settlements of the Vikings lasted, they were not permanent. They lasted for a couple hundred years, but they did fade out of existence by about, I want to say, the 1450s. Everyone had either left or died in Greenland. So they were establishing colonies. They had explored all the way out here into this inhospitable region and place, but they were not able to stick around. It was far too much. There's a couple of reasons as to why this is possible, and part of that actually has to do with this image that I was going to talk about over here. That is walrus tusk. That's an image of walrus tusk that we have in our collection, and walrus tusk was actually a huge export of Greenland for a very long time. But over time, walrus tusk is going to be devalued because of the new usage and more popular usage of elephant ivory rather than walrus ivory around that period of time as these settlements start to decline. So there's been a lot of conversations as to, well, why did Greenland fail? That's part of the reason. There was also a little ice age in around 1250, which makes it, you know, pretty hard to stay in an already very icy place. But in the midst of all this, there is a brief moment where Greenland is doing phenomenally well. Eric has established himself. People have started to come out here. Greenland is really starting to build as a community and as a colony. And one of the people who kind of helps this get kicked off is actually a guy named Bjarni Herjolfsson. Bjarni was a Viking merchant originally from Iceland, but his dad left Iceland while Bjarni was out sailing. So Bjarni's father, he leaves Iceland and goes to Greenland with Eric the Red. Bjarni comes home, realizes, well, my dad's gone. I don't really have anything here, and I've got some stuff that would be pretty helpful for those people who are living out there. Let me see if I can go follow him and find him. Now, this is where the sagas start to paint a different picture. In one of the sagas, Bjarni doesn't even exist. In the other saga, Bjarni is actually considered the first person to sight North American soil. You see, Bjarni was intending originally to use his tools and his abilities as a mariner to go straight from Iceland all the way to Greenland. And people had already kind of had word and conversations about, you sail due west, you'll run right into it. But unfortunately, a storm blew Bjarni way off course. And so as he was getting blown off course around 986, he is sent off course by these storms far, far south. And it is said that he sights land where There hadn't been land sighted at first. This is again 986, the first European that we have evidence of that may have sighted land of North America. Bjarni looks at it and says, nope, not gonna go there, and continues to sail back home. He does manage to make it home. But in the sagas, it is said that Bjarni is actually one who eventually inspires our friend Leif Erikson to go out on this voyage and find his way to North America and set foot on the North American continent for the first time. So these images up here, the two on the right are actually the statue that you can see when you're first coming into the Mariners Museum and Park. It's one of the first things you can see if you're coming from Warwick Boulevard. It's far out there in the open where all the flags are located. That is our bronze statue of Leif Erikson. Now, Leif was an interesting guy as well, because Leif also was the son of Eric the Red, hence the last name Eriksson. Now, Leif was given instructions at one point because Greenland's still pretty new as a colony and Eric is trying to maintain his power. Again, this is all according to these sagas. Eric's trying to maintain his power. He says, Leif, I need you to go back to Norway and talk to the king about getting us some better ships and more people out here so we can really establish this colony. So Leif goes, trying to convince the king of Norway to send more trading ships. But in the process, the person in charge had already shifted. The guy who was in charge was, I believe, to be King Olaf, who was one of the first Christian kings of Norway. Now, King Olaf, upon receiving Leif, is like, hey, you should become a Christian. And Leif says, I guess you're the king, and is baptized. Now, Leif eventually, as he's baptized and has these conversations, Olaf says, you're going to go back and you're going to baptize the people of Greenland in my name. You're going to go baptize them. You're going to bring them to this faith. We will be this great Christian nation. It'll be awesome. Leif says, okay. He heads back home. Now, the reason I mention this is because it is a possible reason for why Leif leaves Greenland once he arrives. Leif comes back to Greenland, and the people are already starting to suffer the consequences of being in this icy wasteland called Greenland. Eric and many of his other folks are looking for a way to appease the people and keep them around. And it is possible that around this time, the people were starting to clamor for more land finding, similar to what Eric had done just a few decades ago. Leif goes down and speaks to Bjarni because Bjarni had mentioned, hey, there's this land that I saw in this storm. I didn't go check it out, but maybe that'd be cool if somebody did. Leif gathers up a crew, many of the same men who had sailed with Bjarni to begin with. And he sets sail. Now, in one of the sagas, Leif was supposed to take his father Eric with him. The story goes that Eric was on a horse riding on down to get on the ship, and the horse fell over and Eric hurt himself. And Eric said, that's a sign that I should not go. I am going to doom your voyage, so I'm going to stay behind. Some historians claim maybe Eric was just being a coward and he didn't want to go, but others say, yeah, no, that's actually pretty fair. I wouldn't want to get on a ship either if I had just fallen off my horse. That wouldn't be very good for the voyage. Thanks to maybe, again, was this a literary tale or not, right? 15 years after Bjarni first sighted North American soil, Leif goes with his crew. Leif eventually lands on what is believed to be Baffin Island, and he names it Helluland, or Flatland Rock. Because Baffin Island, they clearly knew, could not establish or support a colony. Baffin Island at the time was flat. The way that they described it was that there were few to no trees. There was not enough good stuff out there for them to want to establish a colony. So he names it Flatland Rock, and then he leaves. Then they land later on. They leave Helluland, and they land in a new place called Markland, which they name Markland for forest land, because as they arrive in this new place, it says that there were large forests all across this region. Now, the sagas say that upon reaching this place, they went back to their ship as fast as possible. it's forest land. Why didn't they stay? Why didn't they make this a potential place? Some historians claim that it has to do with the favorable winds that they were seeing that would take them further south. It's hard to say exactly. But for this next bit, I actually just want to read straight from one of the sagas. Now, this third landing, this is the last one. This is the one where everyone gets the most excited. Leif has already discovered and landed as the first European on North American soil. That's already an accomplishment in and of itself. But this third landing is a bit more controversial in terms of where did he go? Where did he actually end up? We're pretty positive about the other two. But for this third one, this is what the book, the Flatty Yarbok, describes. Now sailed they from thence on the sea before northeast, and were out for 2 days, ere they saw land, and sailed to this land, and came to an island, which lay to the north of the land, and went up there and looked about in fine weather, and found that there was dew on the grass. And it happened to them that they touched the dew with their hands and brought it to their mouths, and thought not to have known anything so sweet as this. Afterwards, they went to their ship and sailed into a sound that lay between the island and that cape, which went to the north from the land, steering to the west of the cape. There was very shallow at ebb tide, and stood there aground their ship, and was there far to the sea to see from the ship. Yet they were so very curious to go ashore that they could not bide that the high water would rise under their ship, but ran to the land, where a river fell into the sea from a lake. I want to point something out here just as these descriptions. One of the reasons some people really claim these sagas are more than just works of fiction is because of the descriptions of how they are navigating. The Vikings did not have specific access to things like latitude or longitude. Many people believe that the sagas were more of a mariner's guide as to how to get to these newly named regions that these Viking explorers had found. And the descriptions of these rivers, of the land, of the height and the depths of the tides, many believe that that is why these should be considered more than just a story. In any case, as soon as the tide rose under their ship, they took the boat and rowed to the ship and conveyed it up the river, afterwards into the lake, and cast their anchor, and brought from the ship their leather bags and made their booths. Took that resolution afterwards to abide there for that winter, and made there a large house. Neither wanted their salmon in the river nor in the lake, and larger salmon than they had seen before. There were so good land qualities that it seemed to them that there might no cattle fodder be wanted in winter time. There came no frost in winter, and little withered the grass. Nor was there equal length of day and night than in Greenland or Iceland. The sun, and I'm going to mispronounce a bunch of these, so I'm actually not even going to say this. They're describing the observations of where the sun is positioned using their own understandings and their own words. This is further evidence that they used some sort of tool, again, going back to that tool I'd mentioned before. But when they had made their house building, Leif said to his fellows, "Now I will let our company be divided into 2 parts, and I will let the land be explored, and one half of the party shall remain at home, while the other half shall explore the land." The reason why this description in this book and in the others is so controversial is because we are still arguing over exactly where Leif landed his ship. Because as he splits these 2 parties, one of these parties finds grapes, and they come back and they are so excited that they name this last place Vinland, or Grapeland is what it is sometimes known as, or Vineland specifically. Now, when they leave, they've collected these vines, they've collected some of the grapes. They will eventually go back home to Greenland. This is already establishing the Vikings that this is going to be a new colony that they're going to be in. But again, where they landed is a huge point of contention. Some people have said maybe he got to about Newfoundland. Some people said he went as far as Nova Scotia and landed down here. Others have claimed that Vinland is actually as far south as Cape Cod. Now, where exactly that is, we're still unsure. But we know for certain that they landed in North American soil. Now, they find Vinland, or so they've claimed. Okay? The person who actually ends up finding these vines is actually Leif's foster father, I'm going to mess it up again, Tyrkern, who was part of his crew. When they go back, everyone is so excited about the potential for this brand new place. So several new voyages begin to take place. One of the two of the most important ones are going to be Thorvald Eriksson, Leif's brother, and Thorfinn Karlsefni. Leif's brother is going to be the next one to take up this mantle of exploration, heading to this Vinland. He's going to get there. He uses and tries to trace a similar route to what Leif originally did. Now, again, where they landed is always up for interpretation. Okay, some people have been claiming that, it went as far south during some of these exploration, as far south as the Chesapeake Bay, down to here where we are. Do we think that that's the case here necessarily at the Mariners Museum? Not necessarily, but it's difficult to provide clear, definitive answers as to where they landed. But Thorvald eventually takes up this mantle of exploration. Leif will eventually take over Greenland, which is why Thorvald is the one to go back out and continue these voyages. Thorvald explored further into Vinland and encounters for the first time Native Americans of this region. Now, this is going back to that violent kind of understanding that we've had of the Vikings and their piratical ways. The sagas describe their very first interaction with the Native Americans as capturing them and then immediately killing as many of them as they could within moments of meeting these people. One managed to escape. Thorvald and his crew continued to explore a little further, and they noticed a settlement in the distance, but then they took a nap because they were exhausted from killing innocent people. You know, classic. But upon waking, these indigenous peoples were already chasing them down because, one of them got away. Thorvald and his men managed to repel the natives and escape, but Thorvald was badly wounded, which ended up causing his death. They ended up taking the rest of that time and returned to Greenland, putting a little bit of a damper on whether or not Vinland was worth exploring. Now, that's just Thorvald. The next set of explorations is picked up by Thorfinn Karlsefni. Now, Karlsefni, he's going to go and explore Vinland. And again, there's conversations about how far he went, because Karlsefni is described to have explored even further than Thorvald. It's still difficult to say, but what we can say for certain is that according to the sagas, both Thorvald and Thorfinn followed similar routes to Leif, and they stayed for a time at the settlements that Leif had originally established. So there was at least a long-lasting settlement to some degree done by Leif. And I'm running out of time. I know, I'm sorry. I'm going to wrap up soon, I promise. Now, Karlsefni, on his voyages, he is going to end up bringing his wife with him. And they end up having a child there who's supposedly the first European born on American soil. But the reason that these Vikings stopped coming to the supposed legendary Vinland most likely has to do with this next iteration of meetings with the people that the Vikings called Skraelings, wretched ones, believed to be the indigenous peoples of the area. They did trade with them for a while, but eventually they would fight, and then in fighting lost the lives of several Vikings. Karlsefni and his people eventually decided to leave Vinland behind, and then all other purposes of exploring Vinland were left to only be exploration rather than establishing a colony. No further women would go to establish long-lasting settlements. Instead, they were simply going to pillage and find what they could. One of the other reasons for that is because Greenland did not have a vast majority of the wood they needed for shipbuilding. They needed to import from Norway often. So the hope and goal was if they could establish a colony here in North America, they would have the ability to send it back to Greenland. But because of the violence, it is believed that that is why the Vikings eventually gave up on establishing this colony. Now, we at the Mariners Museum believe this is the general route that was taken by Leif Erikson. We believe that he landed here in Newfoundland and maybe perhaps went about as far as northern Nova Scotia, particular right up here to Prince Edward Island. That's about where we believe Leif managed to get to. But again, the sources are unclear. We do know for certain that there is a Viking establishment, there is a Viking settlement that is from this time period archaeologically that was found in a place called L'Anse Meadows. Now, L'Anse Meadows simply is French for the Bay by Meadows, which is just the English word. And again, the descriptions from the sagas line up pretty well, not perfectly, but pretty well with the archaeological finds at L'Anse Meadows. So it is possible that that is where Leif managed to establish himself, but it's not entirely 100% sure. But we do know for a fact, regardless of how far-fetched these sagas might seem, the Vikings did manage to make a settlement here in North America. They may not have made it as far as some historians have claimed. They may not have made it as long as some had thought, and this may not necessarily be Leif Erikson's victory, but we know for certain that Vikings did manage to make their way across the Atlantic before they had access to a magnetic compass, which in and of itself is an incredible feat. So, were they pirates or explorers? Why don't we vote? Who wants to say that the Vikings were pirates? Raise your hands if you think they were pirates. We've got probably about a third of us, hands down. Who thinks they were explorers? I see more hands for explorers. I see some of the same hands, I'm not gonna lie. That's okay, that's okay. When we're talking about the Vikings, things we need to pay attention to. They were brilliant mariners, and they made an incredible impact on the world around them. Besides just the cultural impact, they managed to complete what seemed to be an impossible feat of crossing the Atlantic before modern navigational tools were available. They were brilliant explorers. They found lands where many simply could not, and they did establish lasting colonies and settlements in inhospitable conditions. Though they eventually failed, they did manage to set these things up. But the reason they're remembered is mostly due to the fear they had instilled in people as they pillaged and raided. They enslaved the people that they captured, killed those they didn't, and they took what they wanted. They are an interesting group of people, but they are multifaceted, just like every other group of people that we will ever talk about. They were brilliant mariners, as evidenced by both the Viking sagas and the archaeological finds at L'Anse Meadows. They were merchants and farmers and people who established a long-lasting cultural impact. They were also raiders and pillagers who enacted violence on anyone they did not agree with, whether it be friend or foe. As people who study history, we have to be able to hold both the good and the bad at the same time. And if we can't, we need to reevaluate what it is we're doing. Thank you, y'all.